Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is my Friday reads, which I'm recording late Friday evening because I wanted to finish one of the books I'm going to talk about, but it won't be posted till Saturday. So I completed 3 books this week. Life, a User's Manual by Georges Perec, which is a buddy read with Celia over at Celia. Clayton Eshleman, Fracture, which is a book of poetry from the 1980s. And my first, Michael Cisco, The Narrator, which I hadn't heard of Michael Cisco. I was turned on to him by Jason over at Byways in Bookland, and Jason is reading a book of Cisco's called Unlanguage, and I suspect that we might both be better off reading each other's book. I might be better off reading Unlanguage, and he might be better off reading this, although he's only just started Unlanguage. Okay. So on to Georges Perec, Life, a User's Manual. What a delight this was. 5 stars. It's basically all life within a Paris apartment block. One of those old-fashioned ones with the lift that runs through the middle of it. And one of the long-time residents wants to paint a massive sort of picture of all the rooms and all the people who've lived there and passed through the building, which is a massive sort of enterprise, because there's almost sort of 80 odd years of experience lived there, and a lot of the residents there, there are stories preceding them, either of relatives or the people they bought the flat from. And it is sort of Parisian life over the last 100 years, a sort of rich tapestry, which is what's remarkable about this is very little happens in the now. There's very little who's doing what in the room. It's all about the previous history. It's almost like the ghosts of these rooms. And there's a lot of detailed description about the furnishings and the adornments and the gewgaws and knickknacks, the art on the wall, all that kind of stuff. So you get this mixture of quite detailed description of how a room or how a flat has been furnished as a guide to the mentality of the people who live there. But then you also get the storytelling of how they come to be there, what they're, there's a lot of thwarted dreams in here. There's a lot of people having to pick up and move from other places and have sort of washed up in Paris. But the storytelling is just wonderful. Normally I'm not all that sort of bothered by story, but Perec is so proficient and light touched with it. They're funny. In 1 or 2 places they pull at your heartstrings. There's stories of murderers, con men, thieves, ballerinas, all this sort of stuff. Wonderful panoply of stories. And to me, really, although there is a couple of themes I'll talk about briefly in a minute, this is really a book that just tells a lot of stories, and wonderfully so. So one of the themes that does sort of run through it is that there's a character called Bartlebooth who is very well off, and sort of in his sort of 20s is trying to come up with a plan for his life. So he contacts the guy who's called Verlaine, who's the one who actually painting this 60 years later, to teach him how to do watercolour painting. And he has lessons every day with Verlaine. And when he sort of considers himself good enough, he then goes around 500 harbours and ports around the world over 20 years or 25 years, I can't remember exactly how many, with his faithful servant. And he paints, he has 2 weeks in each place, and on the penultimate day before he leaves to move on to the next one, he paints the harbour as a watercolour. And he posts it back to another resident of this apartment block called Gaspard Winkler, who takes the painting and turns each one into a 750-word jigsaw puzzle. So that when Bartlebooth has finished his tour, his world tour of harbours, he comes back and then he gives himself 2 weeks to do one of the puzzles. And Winkler is such a fiendish puzzle maker that they're not that straightforward. and then when he's finished it, when he's completed it, he then returns it to all its constituents. That is, he sort of, works with another resident to sort of sear the picture off the front of the jigsaw. So then you've just got the pieces, blank pieces, and then he sort of destroys them. And he does this as a self-acknowledged complete waste of, something of no consequence. To construct from nothing, to build up these jigsaws, to solve them, and then to deconstruct them back into nothing. So there's, that theme of jigsaws, sort of, and reality, and the photograph, or not the photograph, the representation of reality of the harbour, which is built up piece by piece by piece of a jigsaw, and then deconstructed piece by piece, and then sort of effaced, is very much a theme of what is reality. And then there's sort of other things that sort of tangentially sort of collide with that. So there's quite a lot of recursion in this book. That is images of themselves in other sort of retreating ever smaller. So for example, a cheese is described which is wrapped in a wrapper which has as its logo 4 months holding a cheese, which is wrapped in a thing which has 4 months holding a cheese. So it's that kind of recursion which I think feeds into this notion of Bartlebooth's quest of, what has solidity. All that is solid melts into air. Bartlebooth's, lifetime's work absolutely manifests that. But in a way, there's a lot of lost life, past life, disappeared life within every room in this apartment block. Some of the stories are of a vanished world, of adventurers or chivalry or Amazonian women or whatever it may be. So I just thought this was wonderful, 5 stars, and I know Celia's going to talk about it on her channel, but I mean we both felt so charmed by this book. We both loved it. And now to something completely different. So Clayton Eshleman, who actually turned 85, or was it? Yeah, 85 this Monday that's just gone. So happy birthday to Clayton Eshleman. If I have the chutzpah to say that, because this is the first one of his works that I've ever read. And I came across him in Elliot Weinberger's book, Works on Paper. Weinberger, who's one of the many things, is an essayist but also a poetry critic. And of all the poets he wrote about from the 80s, 70s and 80s, in that, this was the one that grabbed me, and it was this book in particular. And again, I'll come to why. So Eshleman grew up in Indiana, and he started writing poetry in the late 30s, and realised that he was sort of archetypical white hayseed jock, and didn't really like the limitations of that. So he went travelling. He translated other poets like Aimé Césaire and César Vallejo from Peru. And his own poetry sort of gradually changed. And this is the hinge one, I think, not that I've read the others, because one of his abiding interests is cave paintings, Paleolithic cave paintings, and has actually had the privilege of actually going down into Cisco caves and seeing the paintings in his wife. I'm not sure if he'd done that when he wrote this or he's done it since, but he's had 7 or 8 pilgrimages down to different these ancient caves. Whether he's actually got access to them or not, I don't know. But he definitely got access to the Cisco caves once. And what's interested him is he's not interested in sort of Christianity. He peels back sort of Greek and Roman classicism. He's gone further back. He's gone to almost the dawn of mankind, where man was much more unformed, really. He sort of takes the cave art as that moment when man expressed imagination, that he no longer was a sort of a literalist, but could imagine, speculate, represent, symbolise, and all that sort of thing through his cave painting, which is obviously a very key sort of developmental stage. And it's he posits that it's the beginning of man shedding his animalistic sides, which at that stage was sort of quite pure and unformed, and obviously there's an element of corruption through what man's gone on to become. But it was all up for grabs at that stage to Eshleman's mind, that even something like gender and sex were still sort of manoeuvring for what sex was, who had the power, what the relations were between male and female. So a lot of language here is, in a way, is still sort of quite disappointingly male and patriarchal. But there are also nods to the power that women would have held at that time as well, because obviously, the knowledge of childbirth was a lot more primitive and undeveloped than what we have now. But clearly, women were venerated for having that power in a way that men didn't. So these are the elements that he brings together, and there's the first two sections are sort of very much inspired by the sort of Paleolithic cave paintings. Then there's a sort of a Disney section, which I think is quite interesting, and then there's some others where I just felt the momentum sort of fell away a bit. But it's really the cave painting inspired poems that I found astounding. So I'm going to read a couple of bits. So this is called The Soul of Intercourse. Last night I smuggled a hard-on across the border while the Mexican woman sat on it to keep it out of sight. I remained in the entrance of myself, a parasite for life in the gullet of my female, my cowl, my arch burial. There, with all my legs braced, I will release my impotence across this border, and because it is baptized with menstrual rings, it will arch, as if to bridge the ice below, then move across into a shady grove where Elk-leaf Velasquez bestows a skimpy crown on the head of a kneeling borracho, which is a drunk, Spanish for drunk. And this poem, or part of the poem I should say, is from a poem called The Loaded Sleeve of Hades, which has a really interesting image, which I'll read briefly, but then move on to the bit that I really like. The Loaded Sleeve of Hades, he's talked about the sort of very narrow apertures within these caves. Of course, humans are smaller in Paleolithic days than they are now, but it's almost like a rebirth through the womb. You have to go on all fours and pass through these narrow cave passages. You find yourself at last, as if it were a blessing, blocked by nature, as a new plan is blocked out, attacked by a cave, because you got too close to the Hades Dionysius-hinged appetite. Once crushed off the stem, Dionysius runs Hades' empty sleeve, you might say. They join sleeves to become one loaded sleeve, a tunnel, in which death is exuberance twisted. And then he goes on about a car crash that he had that, almost took him into death. But the bit I really liked in this poem was, seeing how close you came to never, you might draw always a bit closer, and beg it not to hide its head under its cloak. Coaxed out, would its face be hairy? Yes, and pillar-like. It would be before image, unlike never, which is beyond image. A faceless face always curls up under never's tail, and manages to nurse, sending up its aniline rodent tongue into never's pouch of stories. There it fishes about like a word inside its etymological compost. I just really, really like that. And then finally, one that is specifically sort of, talks about the whole cave painting thing. Suppose I placed my baby's book of events in a niche in one of Lescaut's galleries. Would these mothers make anything of, quote, Bock old mama, taka new mama, which I assume is a poem that he wrote. My first sentence in combustion with the Hitlerian age 1937, and blood was already gushing from the breast-severed Nanking of world individualism. Stalin was crouched, O Goya, your Saturn. My language shut in its stall, terrified stag by waterhole, as the fathers fixed the potential to dream and scrawl the clouds of animality as they shredded to open a blue immensity, as if the sky were entrance of an earth cave. We were always on the verge of leaving, and so we remain threshold in gravity, even though the autonomous animal gods are departing in sobbing pairs over the horizon. We grip and slide about, beginner skaters still. So I think that's very much about his personal journey. You know, not that he necessarily had a rebirth, but that, you know, his language shut. He doesn't like that, his early work, this sort of narrow-minded Indiana farm boy, that he did sort of undergo a transformation, and the importance of sort of widening his imagination and his openness to other things. So, you know, I thought that was, you know, as a collection, it did drop off slightly towards the end, but I still gave it 5 stars. And finally, Michael Cisco, the narrator, described on the back by Jeff Vandermeer as like Kafka. No, it isn't. You know, this is sort of supposed to be postmodern, new, weird, dark fantasy, all that sort of genre. Best exemplified by China Miéville. And it's very, I have to say, you know, I don't like fantasy. I've read a lot of Miéville. And, you know, this is very much in that camp of imagistic writing, in that it's lots and lots of phantasmagoric things that don't occur in daily life. One after the other are reeled off. But the problem I have with it is that it's so prosaic. Not the imagination. The imagination displayed by Miéville and by Cisco is great, but the language is very prosaic. It doesn't give the reader time to bask in it, because you're on to the next one. You're forced onto the next one. There's no pause for breath here. So we can't appreciate and suffuse ourselves with these. And also they're sort of tossed off, by which I don't mean, you know, not given sort of great thought. They are, but because they're not differentiated from one from another, they are sort of, you know, tossed off. That's the only way I can sort of describe it. So the reader is not really invited to appreciate, you know, the phantasmagoric elements within this book. It's basically a guy gets conscripted to an army, and he has 4 roles. He's a narrator, so he's responsible for chronicling the, you know, everything to do with this campaign. He's also the clerk of the seer, the commander-in-chief that's leading the expedition. Well, that makes sense. He's a translator. He can read any language that they encounter. And he's also the medic. You know, he sort of binds up the wounded. So, you know, he has all these roles. But, you know, the postmodern bits are sort of laid early, in the sense of he's a narrator. He's going to tell the story of war. Not just this campaign, but war and all its meaninglessness. But the postmodern bits are that he uses certain metaphors and similes. And he goes, I don't know where that came from, because I've never seen this image that I've just used as a simile. So that, you know, that sees the ground. You think, oh, this is going to be interesting. But then it's never really developed until the very end, when, you know, which obviously I can't talk about. But throughout it, it's sort of referred to, but like the wonderful phantasmagoric images, it's just sort of there. It's not drawing attention to itself and making you think and speculate, you know, what does this mean? Why is this there? What's this going to lead to? So it's really disappointing in that sense. And, you know, ultimately it just became, you know, it's 450 pages. It's just a drag. One battle after another. And then when they're sort of having downtime, rest and recuperation, it's descriptions of things that have no import. You know, I'm going to read a sample to give you an example of exactly what I mean about this sort of prosaicness. So the Kafka elements that I think Vandermeer was referring to, is the first part of this book is there's sort of an assembly point in a town, and they're waiting for sort of orders and all their equipment and stuff, and so there's a lot of hanging around. It is a bit sort of Kafkaesque bureaucracy, but it isn't really. It's a bit weak to try and claim that. The armour worn by the guards, who are spelt Ghuards because they're an ethnicity, not a whatever, is worth describing in some detail. No, it really isn't. It is all or nearly all made of a special paper-like metal, the same kind Wakagan used for their leg bands. See, greaves would have been a more interesting, more literary word than leg bands. It's an uncanny experience seeing the guards in their armour. You begin to wonder if you've gone deaf, because massive as it is, the armour makes almost no noise at all. No thundering footsteps, no clattering. Huge forms sail by you, as quiet and as easy moving as balloons, which is a strange image. The helmets are traditionally moulded to resemble the heads of berserk jackasses, with ears 3 foot long, bolt upright on top of them. The eyes are great blind concavities with a slit for each of the occupants' eyes recessed at their innermost edges, flanking the false perspective nose ridge, actually a flat trench, not encroaching on the guard's field of vision. In a perversely inspired bid for perfect ugliness, the designers had trapezoidal openings cut on either side of the muzzle, and male jowls hang flabby out of these. The rest of the false face is a wedge snout with a horrifying, if rather nicely rendered, snark of projecting axe-head-shaped teeth. A narrow, shaggy mane of needles runs in a tapering stripe down the rear of the helmet to the small of the back, rippling hypnotically like the scintillation of a wheeling school of fish. When have I ever seen a school of fish wheeling? So that last part is what I was saying before. That's an interesting concept. We use these metaphors and similes, even though we might not have directly experienced it ourselves. So where does it come from? But, that aside. So he's gone into some great detail, paints us a picture of these soldiers and their sort of phantasmagoric appearance. But we never meet them again. It's something he passes in one of the staging posts, and that's it. So it becomes gratuitous. It's just, I've come up with this image, I'm going to describe it to you in great detail, and then I'm going to pass on to something else. That's what I mean. That's what I find so frustrating with this genre. Mielville does it, particularly in his book, The Last Days of the New Paris, and Cisco does it. And in the end, it just gets dull, because it's one image after another, but they're not rooted in anything. They're not referring to anything. One or two make an appearance elsewhere in the book, but things like the guards, that's it. That's their one and only appearance. And you just think, well, what's the point of that? Their helmets are traditionally moulded to resemble the heads of berserk jackasses, with ears 3 foot long, bolt upright on top of them. Okay, why? So what? What are you trying to say? Nothing. It's just he's got this visual image and he wants to convey it to us. So he writes it, he describes it, but there's nothing else. So I'm afraid I really did not like this book at all, and I gave it 2 stars. I gave it 2 stars, actually, because one thing he does write well is whenever he uses the images of flies. So there's a battlefield scene where there's lots of dead bodies, so the flies start getting attracted to the corpses. There's just sort of this huge mound of flies, like a Damien Hirst installation. But one of the soldiers has got a leg injury, and the flies also sort of, flock around that. And that was a really powerfully written thing. And another thing, when they're sort of passing a body of water, like a pond or something, and, the flies are said to dimple it as they bounce off the surface, as they hit the surface and then bounce off. So he can write, I'm not disputing that, but just to what end? As far as this whole new, weird, dark fantasy stuff, I just don't get it, I'm afraid. Okay, so that's what I have finished. What I started, selected poems of Rainer Maria Rilke, which I'm buddy reading with Luke Catch of Totally Pretentious through the course of June. There's 4 sections, we're doing 1 section a week, so I won't talk about this till we finished it. I decided to reread Reality Hunger by David Shields, and I'm just under halfway through this. Still holds up. I know it was controversial at the time, he got a lot of clog for it, but I don't really understand why. I mean, he's basically he's seeking a perfect art form for him. And it's not the novel and it's not memoir, because they're both deeply flawed. How do they relate to reality and all that sort of thing? So so far in the first 80 pages, his preference is lyrical essay, which is fine. It's not what I write. So when he sort of proclaims about the death of the novel, my hackles rise a bit. But I don't feel ill-disposed to him like a lot of people did when this book came out. And I shall get back to Clarice Lispector's The Chandelier, which I put down for my Perec buddy read, and it'd be good to get back to this. Okay, so there you have it. Thanks very much. Till next time.